When discussing the large-scale structure of the cosmos, astronomers sometimes say that space is curved, or that the universe is finite but unbounded. Whatever are they talking about? Let's imagine that we are perfectly flat. I mean absolutely flat. And that we live, appropriately enough, in a flatland. A land designed and named by Edwin Abbott, a Shakespearean scholar who lived in Victorian England. Everybody in flatland is, of course, exceptionally flat. We have squares, circles, triangles, and we all scurry about, and we can go into our houses and do our flat business. Now, we have width and length, but no height at all. Now, these little cutouts have some little height, but let's ignore that. Let's imagine that these are absolutely flat. That being the case, we know, us flatlanders, about left-right, and we know about forward-back, but we have never heard of up-down. Let us imagine that into flatland, hovering above it, comes a strange three-dimensional creature which, oddly enough, looks like an apple. And the three-dimensional creature sees an attractive, congenial-looking square, watches it enter its house, and decides in a gesture of interdimensional amity to say hello. "Hello," says the three-dimensional creature. "How are you? I am a visitor from the third dimension." Well, the poor square looks around his closed house, sees no one there, and what's more, has witnessed a greeting coming from his insides, a voice from within. He surely is getting a little worried about his sanity. The three-dimensional creature is unhappy about being considered a psychological aberration, and so he descends to actually enter flatland. Now, a three-dimensional creature exists in flatland only partially. Only a plane, a cross-section through him can be seen. So when the three-dimensional creature first reaches flatland, it's only the points of contact which can be seen. And we'll represent that by stamping the apple in this ink pad and placing that image in flatland. And as the apple were to descend through, slither by flatland, we would progressively see higher and higher slices, which we can represent by the apple. So the square, as time goes on, sees a set of objects mysteriously appear from nowhere and inside a closed room and change their shape dramatically. His only conclusion could be that he's gone bonkers. Well, the apple might be a little annoyed at this conclusion, and so, not such a friendly gesture from dimension to dimension, makes a contact with the square from below and sends our flat creature fluttering and spinning above flatland. At first, the square has no idea what's happening. He's terribly confused. This is utterly outside his experience. But after a while, he comes to realize that he is seeing inside closed rooms in flatland. He is looking inside his fellow flat creatures. He is seeing flatland from a perspective no one has ever seen it before to his knowledge. Getting into another dimension provides as an incidental benefit a kind of X-ray vision. Now our flat creature slowly descends to the surface, and his friends rush up to see him. From their point of view, he has mysteriously appeared from nowhere. He hasn't walked from somewhere else. He's come from some other place. They say, "For heaven's sake, what's happened to you?" And the poor square has to say, "Well, I was in some other mystic dimension called up." And they will pat him on his side and comfort him, or else they'll ask, "Well, show us, where is that third dimension? Point to it." And the poor square will be unable to comply. But maybe more interesting is the other direction in dimensionality. What about the fourth dimension? Now, to approach that, let's consider a cube. We can imagine a cube in the following way. You take a line segment and move it at right angles to itself in equal length. That makes a square. Move that square in equal length at right angles to itself, and you have a cube. Now, this cube, we understand, casts a shadow. And that shadow we recognize. It's, ordinarily drawn in third grade classrooms as two squares with their vertices connected. Now, if we look at the shadow of a three-dimensional object in 2 dimensions, we see that, in this case, not all the lines appear equal. Not all the angles are right angles. The three-dimensional object has not been perfectly represented in its projection in 2 dimensions, but that's part of the cost of losing a dimension in the projection. Now, let's take this three-dimensional cube and project it, carry it through a 4th physical dimension. Not that way, not that way, not that way, but at right angles to those 3 directions. I can't show you what direction that is, but imagine that there is a 4th physical dimension. In that case, we would generate a 4-dimensional hypercube, which is also called a tesseract. I cannot show you a tesseract because I and you are trapped in 3 dimensions. But what I can show you is the shadow in 3 dimensions of a 4-dimensional hypercube or tesseract. This is it. And you can see it's 2 nested cubes, all the vertices connected by lines. And now the real tesseract in 4 dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles. That's not what we see here, but that's the penalty of projection. So you see, while we cannot imagine the world of 4 dimensions, we can certainly think about it perfectly well. Now, imagine a universe just like Flatland, truly 2-dimensional, and entirely flat in every direction, but with one exception. Unbeknownst to the inhabitants, their 2-dimensional universe is curved into a 3rd physical dimension, maybe into a sphere, but at any rate, into something entirely outside their experience. Locally, their universe still looks flat enough, but if one of them, much smaller and flatter than me, takes a very long walk along what seems to be a straight line, he would uncover a great mystery. Suppose he marked his starting point here and set off to explore his universe. He never turns around and he never reaches an edge. He doesn't know that his apparently flat universe is actually curved into an enormous sphere. He doesn't sense that he's walking around a globe. Why should his space be curved? Because there's so much matter in this universe that it gravitationally warps space, closing it back on itself into a sphere. But our Flatlander doesn't know this. After a long while, he'll find he somehow returns to his starting point. There must be a 3rd dimension. Our Flatlander couldn't imagine a 3rd dimension, but he could sure deduce it. Now, increase all the dimensions in this story by 1, and you have something like the situation which many cosmologists think may actually apply to us. We are 3-dimensional creatures trapped in 3 dimensions. We imagine our universe to be flat in 3 dimensions, but maybe it's curved into a 4th. We can talk about a 4th physical dimension, but we can't experience it. No one can point to the 4th dimension. I mean, there's left, right, and there's forward, back, there's up, down, and there's some other direction simultaneously at right angles to those familiar 3 dimensions.
If there are other civilizations which are older than our own and have got much further than we have, they must have very advanced technologies. And I wonder what forms these technologies take.
Well, again, very difficult to estimate, but there are stars which are billions of years older than our sun. Some of them very likely have planets, and therefore I can imagine civilizations immensely beyond the capabilities of our own. What capabilities those are, no one can tell. In the same sense, that even the most fantastic prognostications from the middle of the 19th century about the technology of the 20th century all fell short. People like Jules Verne, asked to imagine what transportation devices people would have in 1950, imagined a kind of Victorian living room,
yes,
with plush and velvet furniture in a gondola at the bottom of an enormous balloon which went from New York to San Francisco in only a few weeks. And he was, of course, the most imaginative speculative thinker of the 19th century. Others would have been more cautious. So it's very difficult to predict far into the future, even 100 years, when not only new technology, but new scientific principles may be discovered.
So far, we've been talking about contact either by radio or direct physical contact by space probes. But there might be other means of doing it. It does, I know, sound very like science fiction to talk about teleportation or thought travel. But do you think this is entirely out of the question at the moment? And if so, should we be considering it seriously?
Well, there's very little in science which is absolutely out of the question. But I don't know of any evidence which suggests that we should invest a lot of time and money on those particular ventures, although I would not oppose anyone who thought that it was a useful investment of his time.
Then what should we be doing about this research?
I would say that there are several lines of approach, all of which look promising and should be pursued further. One is laboratory work on the question of the origin of life, making the molecules which here were able to reproduce themselves and led eventually to us. Secondly, a study of the organic chemistry in places like Jupiter, comets, and the interstellar medium. It's remarkable that the molecules of life are littering the cosmos. Thirdly, the space vehicle exploration of the neighboring planets, in particular for life or life-related compounds. If it turns out, for example, that Mars is lifeless, that is not a major disappointment, because then we have two planets near each other in space and time, life developed on one and not on the other. You have the classic case of an experiment and a control. And it'd be very important to investigate why life on the Earth and not on Mars. But even more exciting would be if Mars turns out to have life, for us to investigate what kind of life it is, how similar, how different from life on Earth. That will immensely broaden the science of biology. And then there is certainly the serious work, long-term, patient, cautious investigation of other stars for possible signals being sent our way.
After all, we have made a start, and I'm thinking, of course, of Pioneer 10, which has bypassed Jupiter and is now on its way out of the solar system, carrying a plaque with a message.
Yes, that's right. Pioneer 10 is the first interstellar spacecraft of mankind, but only by accident. That is, it was designed to examine Jupiter and came so close to Jupiter that it was ejected from the solar system by Jupiter's gravity. That being the case, we thought it would be a nice idea to have a kind of cosmic greeting card on it in the remote contingency that it were at some future time to be intercepted by some advanced civilization. And so a 6 by 9 inch gold anodized aluminum plaque was designed, which has a mysterious part and an obvious part to it. The mysterious part is the man and the woman to the right of the plaque. And they will be mysterious because there will not be men and women anywhere else. The rest of the message we think is written in galactic clear, in the one language we have in common with everyone else, namely the language of science. And it essentially indicates the planet from which the spacecraft was launched, the star around which that planet goes, out of the several 100,000 million stars in the galaxy, it specifies one, and the year of launch out of the 10,000 million year history of the galaxy. And it does it by reference to a set of galactic clocks called pulsars. Well, the chance of this being intercepted is small, precisely because space is so empty. It's traveling so slowly, even though it's the fastest thing we've ever launched, that it will take it 80,000 years to get to the nearest star, but it's not headed towards the nearest star. So it will very likely survive for billions of years, but in the dark of interstellar space. It will be the oldest artifact of mankind, because a billion years from now, mountain building and erosion will have destroyed everything on the Earth, and yet this plaque will remain intact.
So, in fact, the plaque may last longer than the Earth itself, which is really rather a sobering thought. Carl, thank you very much.
Governor Hunt, Mr. Park, thank you very much for your extremely generous introduction. My friends, I'm very happy to be here with you. I think the idea of a state organizing a concentrated look on the critical issues of our day involving leaders and ordinary people statewide is extremely important, and I'd like to see this emulated in the other 49 states and maybe 159 other countries. In general, I think it's an excellent idea. And choosing the issue of global change, I think, is extremely important, because here's an issue where the risk is very high. The issue is removed from everyday life. The solutions cannot take place in the course of a year or two. It involves scientific issues which are distant from the familiar everyday acquaintance of many people. And for this constellation of reasons, it poses difficult public policy issues. My own involvement with the issue of global warming did not begin on this, well, I certainly began on this lovely world, but my interest in global warming began in the study of a different world, Venus, our nearest planetary neighbor. It's been my great good fortune to have not only witnessed, but to have participated in the historic first preliminary reconnaissance of the solar system in which we live. Beginning in 1962, when the United States launched the first successful interplanetary vehicle, Mariner 2, we humans, mainly Americans and Soviets, have sent spacecraft to visit all the planets known to the ancients, to our ancestors, and many other worlds besides. We have examined many dozens of other worlds, a few of them in great detail, having landed on their surfaces, and most flying by at great speed, but with instruments of enormous capability taking the data as we speed past. An enormous amount of important and interesting information has been acquired. The perspective that we get about those other worlds illuminates a wide range of science. One of the issues that I've been most focused on, concerned about, is the issue of life elsewhere. And it's certainly a fair summary to say that in these dozens of worlds, while we have many cases of pre-biological organic matter, the stirrings and intimations of life, if you wish, nevertheless, there is nothing, not the least hint of anything alive on those other worlds. I spent over a year, in a manner of speaking, on the planet Mars in 1976-77, after the Viking spacecraft, two of them, landed on Mars. And we had an armory of instrumentation to look for life. There was nothing. Not a mouse, not a footprint, not a microbe, not even an organic molecule. The lesson is that you can have dozens of worlds, some of them of breathtaking splendor and beauty, without life on any of them. Life is something rare and precious. There is something extraordinary about the planet that we are privileged to live on, and in this peculiarly self-congratulatory way about we ourselves. Life is rare. That's the lesson from exploring space. And the lesson from exploring time, if you look back in the geological record at the history of mass extinctions, is that there is no guaranteed tenure for any species, no matter how self-confident on this planet. 65 million years ago, an event occurred which not only wiped out all the dinosaurs, but wiped out most of the species of life on Earth. This can happen to anyone. These explorations in space and time are a reminder or a warning to us that we cannot be guaranteed of our continued happy existence. It's important to understand our world, and I argue others as well. When we look at Venus, we find a world of roughly the same size, mass, density as ours, but a stunning difference, two stunning differences. One is that there's a massive atmosphere, about 90 times the surface pressure of the air right here down on Earth. And the other is that the surface temperature is stunningly hot. The surface of Venus is at 900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt tin or lead, hotter than the hottest household oven. And it's not because Venus is a little closer to the sun, because the clouds of Venus are brighter than the Earth is, and Venus reflects so much more light back to space relative to the Earth that it ought to be cooler, not warmer, than the Earth. Why is Venus at 900 degrees Fahrenheit? Because of the greenhouse effect. That massive atmosphere is made mostly of carbon dioxide, and a large amount of carbon dioxide can trap the heat and warm a planet. Warm it to certainly very uncomfortable levels. This is, I claim, a kind of providential warning to us. I'm not for a moment suggesting that there was once a species of Venusians who refused to drive fuel-efficient automobiles, and this is what happened to their planet. The story is, in fact, even more interesting than that, but I won't go into it here. But the lesson is not only that a greenhouse effect can exist, but that a large greenhouse effect can be exceptionally dangerous. So, for anyone who views our exquisite planet and hears the warnings of scientists and says, all this greenhouse stuff is just some theory, I ask them to reflect on the fate of the planet Venus, our nearest planetary neighbor. By the way, while I'm not going to be talking about it, or at least not much today, Mars is an example of what happens when you don't have an ozone layer. The reason we think that we could find not only no trace of life, but not even an organic molecule on the surface of Mars, is that Mars has a planet-wide ozone hole, so to say. Negligible ozone, ultraviolet light from the sun strikes the surface unimpeded. The surface becomes rich in fabulously oxidizing molecules, and they simply gobble up any organic matter that happens to be there. Mars is also a salutary warning to us, we who are pushing and pulling and tugging on a planetary environment which we still insufficiently understand. Well,
Many of you have attended the sessions today. I was privileged to be able to listen to a few of the extraordinarily interesting papers presented. You know something of the evidence for greenhouse warming, the predicted consequences, the disasters for agriculture, the rise in sea level. I will say a little bit about the evidence later. But I want to ask you to think about the following general, very practical political issue. What happens when a group of scientists makes some prediction of impending disaster? Keep doing such and such, they say, and the following catastrophe will result. And changing that catastrophe, averting it, mitigating it, is going to be expensive. It might require changing the way we think, in which case it's politically expensive, or it might involve changing the way we do business, in which case it is fiscally expensive. One way or another, it's expensive. At what point do policymakers have to take this seriously? This is an issue that is extremely current today. And I'd like to just spend a few minutes on two examples from the rich cultural history of our species of policymakers and predictions of disaster, and I will reach to ancient Greece. Both of these stories can be found in the classic Greek literature, the first in Herodotus, the second in Aeschylus's play Agamemnon. They both are, at least in part, based on historical events. The first case that I want to tell you about is Croesus, king of Lydia. Apollo was the god of the sun, but in addition to being in charge of sunlight, he had another specialty, and that was being in charge of prophecy. Not just generalized prophecy, but systematic prophecy in human institutions called oracles, the most famous of which was the oracle at Delphi. And the way it would work is you would go to Delphi as a supplicant, you would bring some gifts for the priestess, who was called the Pythia. You would say what your concern is, and then from the Pythia, usually in a kind of trance, back would come the advice from the gods, or at least from Apollo. Now, Croesus was immensely rich. There's still a phrase, rich as Croesus. It's almost current, just a little obsolete. One of the reasons he was so rich is that he was one of the boys who invented money. The first metal coins in human history, as far as we know, were coined in Lydia in Croesus's reign. Lydia is in Anatolia, contemporary Turkey. Well, we can speculate on the reason, but Croesus's ambitions were not contained within the boundaries of his small nation. He had grander objectives, and so he thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to conquer Persia? Persia was the superpower of the 7th century BC. The Persian emperor Cyrus had forged a mighty empire by combining two different peoples, the Persians and the Medes. So Croesus had some degree of trepidation because of the power of the Persian Empire, so naturally he sent emissaries to the oracle at Delphi. And the question put by his emissaries on Croesus's behalf was, what will happen if Croesus makes war on Persia? And without hesitation, the Pythia, the priestess, answered, he will destroy a mighty empire. The gods are with us, thought Croesus. Time to invade. So he assembled a vast mercenary army, invaded Persia, and was promptly and humiliatingly defeated. And not only was Lydian power destroyed forever, but he, Croesus was forced to spend the rest of his life as a sort of pathetic minor functionary in the Persian court, a hanger-on ex-king. It's a little bit like, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it's a little bit like the Emperor Hirohito living out his days as a consultant on the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Well, the injustice of it really got to him. After all, Croesus had played by the rules. He had asked for advice from the Pythia, and she gave it to him, he acted on it, and look what happened. She had done him wrong. So, after mulling this over for some years, he sent another emissary to Delphi. This one bearing much less opulent gifts, as was appropriate to his now greatly diminished station. And he asked, how could you do this to me? And here from Herodotus's history is the answer from the god. Quote, "The prophecy given by Apollo ran that if Croesus made war upon Persia, he would destroy a mighty empire. Now in the face of that, said the priestess, if he had been well advised, he should have sent and inquired again whether it was his own empire or that of Cyrus that was spoken of. But Croesus did not understand what was said, nor did he ask questions again, and so he has no one to blame but himself." So much for Croesus. Now, if the Delphic Oracle was just a kind of institutionalized scam to fleece credulous kings, then of course it would have needed excuses to explain away the inevitable, mistakes. Disguised ambiguities are the stock in trade of oracles. Nevertheless, the lesson of the Pythia is germane. Even of oracles, we must ask intelligent questions. Even, or especially, when they tell us what we want to hear. The policymakers must not blindly accept, they have to understand, they have to ask questions, they must not let their own ambitions stand in the way of understanding. The conversion of prophecy into policy must be done with care. And it seems to me this advice is fully applicable to the modern oracles, the scientists and think tanks and universities. Sometimes the policymakers ask them and the prophecy comes back. More often these days, the oracles voluntarily submit, even to those who never asked them. And then the policymakers, have to figure out, what'll I do now? And since the modern oracles are deeply immersed in science and technology, it's very important for the policymakers and the people who determine who the policymakers are to understand science and technology. So this is on the one hand. Now I want to tell you on the other hand story, also from classical Greece. This is also about Apollo and also about oracles. This is the story of Cassandra, Princess of Troy. The event occurs just before the Trojan War begins. The one that Homer wrote about. She was the smartest and the most beautiful of the daughters of King Priam, and Apollo, who, like all the Greek gods, was constantly on the prowl for attractive humans, fell in love with her, or at least that's the way the story is described. Oddly, this almost never happens in Greek myth, she resisted his advances. She was smart, she was beautiful, she was happy. Who needed Apollo? So he tried to bribe her. But what could he give her? She was already a princess. She had everything that she wanted. Apollo thought of something she didn't have. He promised her the gift of prophecy. The offer was irresistible. She agreed. Quid pro quo. Apollo did whatever it is the gods do to create seers, oracles, and prophets out of mere mortals. And then, after he had done that, scandalously, Cassandra reneged. She changed her mind. She refused the overtures of a god. Apollo was not amused. But he couldn't withdraw the gift of prophecy because whatever else you want to say about Greek gods, they keep their promises. So instead, he condemned her to an ingenious and cruel fate, that no one would believe her prophecies. So Cassandra predicts the invasion by the Greeks, headed by Agamemnon. Nobody pays attention. She predicts the fall of Troy. Nobody pays attention. She predicts to the Greeks the death of Agamemnon. They pay no attention. She predicts her own death. Nobody pays any attention to that. Instead, they make fun of her. They call her the Lady of Many Sorrows. Today, it would be something like Prophet of Gloom and Doom. Just minor translational difference, same sentiment. I prophesied to my countrymen, she says, all their disasters. But they ignored her prophecies. They were destroyed. Agamemnon was destroyed, and soon so is she. Well, this resistance to dire prediction is very human, and we can certainly see it today. I mean, if we're faced with some very heavy, ominous prediction that things you never saw happen are going to happen, and it's going to be expensive to mitigate it, we have a natural tendency to reject or ignore the prophecy. And after all, there are no prophets, not even the scientific community, who are right all the time. And you can find competent scientists who have made predictions. Supersonic transports will destroy the ozone layer, for example, that are just wrong. And so it's very easy to dismiss. Also, if the factors precipitating the anticipated catastrophe are long-standing, then the prediction is a kind of rebuke to us. How did we permit this peril to develop? Why didn't we see it beforehand? Why didn't we take political steps to prevent it? So these are uncomfortable ruminations that through our own inattention or inaction, some catastrophe is coming. Put it out of our mind. So this, or find a reason to reject it. This temptation to minimize, to dismiss, is something that psychiatrists know very well about. They have a technical name for it. It's called denial. Denial. The rock group Dire Straits, I'm sure many of you know their repertoire, has a line in one of their songs which goes, "Denial ain't just a river in Egypt." So these two cases, I claim, are the opposite poles of policy response to predictions of disaster. Croesus, representing the pole of sort of credulous, uncritical acceptance, propelled a little bit by greed or other character flaws, and Cassandra, representing, the response to her, representing the pole of stolid, immobile rejection of the possibility of danger. Well, today we have a set of such prophecies. And for all the average person understands, they could just as well have emanated from the Delphic oracle for all the fundamental understanding of the underpinnings there is. So it gets to be a kind of challenge, a battle between two arguments from authority. There's one bunch, they're sort of nice looking, they say it's worrisome. There's this other bunch, they're sort of nice looking, they say it's not worrisome. What'll I choose? Well, I'll choose the one that's most comfortable. I think we are much closer to the danger of Cassandra than of the danger of Croesus. Now, let me give a very brief statement of why I take greenhouse warming so seriously. Those of you who have attended the sessions this morning, this afternoon, have heard a much more detailed, expert summary of these reasons. First of all, there is no question that such a thing as a greenhouse effect exists. I talked about Venus. This benign planet, looking exactly as it does here, but with no greenhouse effect, would be 20 degrees centigrade, that's what, 36 Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of water. With no greenhouse effect, this planet would be frozen solid. The oceans would be 3 kilometers of ice. A little greenhouse effect is a good thing. We owe our lives to the greenhouse effect. No greenhouse effect, we would never have come into being. The principal greenhouse gases are water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, there are some minor constituents, methane, oxides of nitrogen, and chlorofluorocarbons, which go by the brand name freons. And they are an especially interesting aspect of this because they are wholly man-made. You see, astronauts, many of them, in Earth orbit, seeing to the naked, unaided eye this beautiful vista, can make out, as perhaps is hard to do in this picture, the very thin blue aura that surrounds the bright hemisphere, the illuminated hemisphere of the Earth. And that's just the thin atmosphere seen edge on. This phrase, the ocean of air, is a kind of misnomer. Ocean suggests massive, impervious. But instead, that thin line that you can barely make out in this picture is very fragile, vulnerable to the depredations of human beings. Our technology and our numbers have both reached a state where inadvertently we can pose a danger to the global environment, especially through the atmosphere. The abundance of greenhouse gases is increasing. Greenhouse gases act as a kind of blanket, holding the heat in. There is no question that all of the gases I just mentioned are steadily increasing in abundance. In addition, it seems very clear that the average temperature of the Earth has been increasing through the 20th century. It's a noisy record. There are hot years and cold years always, so the curve of temperature versus time has a jagged aspect to it, but the slow increase with time is becoming increasingly clear, and one indication of that is that the 5 hottest years of the 20th century were in the decade of the 1980s. And that is also the decade which had the highest abundance of all of those greenhouse gases. In addition, there is most interesting evidence from an Antarctic ice core taken by a Soviet team, in which the past temperature history of the Earth for tens of thousands of years and the past abundance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can both be measured. They're little bubbles of air that are trapped in the ice, laminated between successive snowfalls. And we find that when the carbon dioxide is higher, the temperatures are higher. When the carbon dioxide is lower, the temperatures are lower. There is a virtually one-to-one correlation. Now, nobody pretends we understand everything about the global climate. There are feedbacks, some of which you warm the Earth a little bit, and the tendency will be to further increase the temperature, so-called positive feedback. and others in which you warm the earth a little and the situation is self-correcting like a thermostat, and it cools the earth a little. And there is a push and pull, a tug between these competing feedbacks. Doubtless, we have not identified all of them. The present consensus, I believe, is that the bad kind of feedback, the ones that make things worse, the so-called positive feedbacks, dominate. I would think it would be an astonishing coincidence if the balance of all these feedbacks just exactly corrected the problem that we are generating through human technology, a kind of deus ex machina, to go back to the Greek analogies. You know, in the Greek plays, when the playwright got himself into a plot pickle and couldn't figure out how to resolve it, then there was an actor on wires representing a god who flew into the set and put everything right. It was called Deus Ex Machina, the god of the machine, from the machine being the device that plopped him down on the stage. It's asking a lot to believe that the problem is going to fix itself. If we look at the prognostications, the three-dimensional general circulation computer models, of which there are some 6 independent models working right now, mainly in the United States, one in UK, they all predict temperature increases of a few degrees centigrade between now and the middle of the next century. And the difference between them is only a factor of 2 in temperature rise. None of the models predict that the Earth's climate's going to get cooler. None of them predict it's going to be tens or hundreds of degrees increase. The agreement, considering the state of our knowledge, is quite good. If you then look at the output of these computer models, which purport to give a sense of how the temperatures change on a regional basis as you go through time, you begin to see some very worrisome things. Yes, there are some places that get cooler and some places they get warmer, but the overall trend is warmer. And by the middle of the 21st century, there's no winner. Every place has gotten warmer. And to give you an idea of how much warmer, a few degrees centigrade global change doesn't sound like so much. Let me point out that a 1 degree temperature change, in this case decrease following a massive volcanic explosion, is enough to produce widespread suffering and famine worldwide, as happened following the Tambora explosion, volcanic explosion in 1815, and other cases which are still more serious. Several degrees is a very major temperature increase. And some of these predictions prognosticate that the American Midwest will be converted into something approaching scrub desert by the second half of the 21st century, and likewise the Soviet Ukraine and so on. But the American Midwest is the breadbasket of the world. If the grain and cereal foodstuffs from those places are unavailable, we are in serious trouble. In addition to the volume expansion of seawater, the melting of glacial and polar ice, sea levels rise, and again there's an uncertainty. Average prediction for the middle of the next century is 1 meter, 3 feet, but it might be as little as 1, and it might be as much as many meters. And then take a look at all the low-lying coastlines all around the world, and ask what happens when the sea level rises. Okay, the Dutch, they're very good at building dikes and levees. They'll build more dikes and levees. That's not going to destroy Holland. But take a look at Bangladesh, where 1 to 3 meter temperature rise will flood an area which is inhabited by tens of millions of people. Where are those guys going to go? Environmental refugees. It's a new prospect. For these reasons, I take very seriously the prediction of greenhouse warming. Now, there are policy makers who would like to respond as follows, and you have perhaps seen this sort of opinion on the pages of, naturally, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. That's the first place to expect a complaint about having to change anything. It's too uncertain, they say. This is serious stuff. There are a few scientists with computer models and who can be sure that they know what they're talking about? You want us to turn everything upside down because some scientists say that things are going to get a few degrees warmer? It's a few degrees warmer on the stage than it is in the audience. You don't see any catastrophe up here, do you? I'd like to pose the following question. Imagine this kind of thinking back in the height of the Cold War. You know, the United States, so let me ask a question. How much money do you think the United States has spent since 1945 on the Cold War? Sometimes I ask this question and from the back of the audience comes an answer, billions and billions. A huge underestimate, billions and billions. The amount of money that the United States has spent on the Cold War since 1945 is approximately $10 trillion. Trillion, that's the big one with the T. What could you buy for $10 trillion? The answer is you could buy everything in the United States except the land. Everything. Every building, truck, bus, car, boat, plane, pencil, baby's diaper. Everything in the United States except the land. That's what we spent on the Cold War. So now let me ask, how certain was it that the Russians were going to invade? Was it 100% certain? Guess not, since they never invaded. What if it was only, let's say, 10% certain? What would advocates of big military buildup have said? They would have said, we must be prudent. It's not enough to count on only the most likely circumstance. If the worst happens and it's really extremely dangerous for us, we have to prepare for that. Remote contingencies, if they're serious enough, have to be prepared for. It's classic military thinking. You prepare for the worst case. And so now I ask my friends who are comfortable with that argument, including the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, why doesn't that same argument apply to global warming? You don't think it's 100% likely? Fine, you're entitled to think that. If it's only a small probability of it happening, since the consequences are so serious, don't you have to make some serious investment to prevent it or mitigate it? I think there's a double standard of argument working, and I don't think we should permit it. Now, let me indicate, what is it you would do if you took greenhouse warming seriously? And what I'm going to try to argue is that virtually every one of the things that you would do to ameliorate greenhouse warming make sense on completely separate grounds. They are worth doing apart from greenhouse warming. Unlike the defense buildup, which made no sense whatever, except if you were confident that there was a real danger of Soviet troops pouring across the Elbe. There was no other mitigating circumstance. It's the least efficient way to spend money if you want to pump the national economy. It drew all sorts of scientific as well as fiscal resources out of the civilian economy. It is largely responsible for the economic chaos of the United States. Whereas, I will argue, spending money on mitigating greenhouse warming makes an enormous amount of sense for other reasons. What are the mitigating steps? First, the greenhouse gas that is increasing most steeply is the CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. It would make a great deal of sense to simply wipe them out, prevent any more production of CFCs. Well, because CFCs also imperil the ozone layer, there is already not just a commitment from the major manufacturers of CFCs to stop producing them, but there is an international agreement called the Montreal Protocol, which most of the major industrial nations have signed, committing themselves to phase out CFC production by the turn of the millennium, by the year 2000. That's an example of what can be done on these global environmental issues. And since CFCs are doubly dangerous, ozone depletion and greenhouse effect, the first step that you would take is in fact being done. So that's a bit of an encouragement. We're not as immobile and resistant to these arguments as you might otherwise expect. Second, energy efficiency. If you can get more power to a house from a given power plant, then for a given amount of energy expenditure, you put less carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. Obviously, you're doing something important for greenhouse warming. 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that is generated in the United States, the worst CO2 polluter on the planet, by the way, comes from automobiles. Why do we permit automobiles that get 15 to 25 miles a gallon when the technology exists for automobiles that get 60 to 100 miles a gallon? That's not a step which will bother anybody except possibly adolescent young men who need to have extremely rapid acceleration for psychological reasons of their own. For all practical purposes, much greater fuel efficiency in automobiles is perfectly possible. And likewise, across the entire spectrum of fossil fuel energy use in our society, fossil fuels being coal, oil, gas, wood, and so on. The stuff that when you burn it, CO2 comes out. The third thing you might want to do is to seek alternative energy sources, alternatives to fossil fuels. Why not have an energy source that doesn't put carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? Is that wholly beyond our technological ability? I don't think so. And while there are a number of alternatives, some of which work in some places, some geographical locales and not in others, the mix looks very promising. I'm talking about tidal, geothermal, wind, and especially solar power. You know, this solar power issue is very interesting, and it has a strong political point. Maybe you remember Jimmy Carter when he was in the White House. For the young of heart in the audience, this was an early American president who preached energy efficiency. And one of the largely symbolic gestures which he did was to install a solar thermal heater in the roof of the White House to make some warm water for presidential showers. And I've forgotten what the fraction of the White House's own energy budget it accounted for. Maybe it was 15, 20%, something like that. But it was a kind of step in a direction which certainly, from what we've learned subsequently, we need to go. The next president of the United States was Ronald Reagan, and one of the first acts upon entering office was to rip the solar thermal converter out of the roof of the White House. And one of the early steps taken in his administration was to enormously reduce funding for solar and other alternative energy sources. We lost 10 years. Despite that, the progress in solar energy technology has been steady and impressive. And if you were to levy an environmental tax on the burning of fossil fuels to pay for the additional burden on the society from the increase of the greenhouse effect, even today, solar energy would be economically competitive with fossil fuels. And if we were to spend some significant amount of research money on solar energy, the price per kilowatt hour would certainly go down. There is a natural issue about what about nuclear energy? Fusion power, which maybe we will have in another few decades, is in principle clean as far as greenhouse gases go, but there is a variety of radioactive waste and other problems which have to be dealt with. Fission power, the kind of power plants we have today, some people believe are a suitable stopgap between fossil fuels and whatever it is that we're going to have as the alternative later on. In my view, there are some conditions which have to be satisfied by fission power plants. They have to be safe. Chernobyl certainly reminds us of that. They have to be cost effective, and the prices have soared through the roof. Their radioactive wastes have to be safely disposable, not for 10 years into the future, but for hundreds or thousands, because that's the half-lives of the radioactive waste. And the fourth criterion I would use is that they must not produce weapons-grade uranium or plutonium, for separate topic, so as not to encourage the nuclear arms race. The burden of proof that fission power plants satisfy those criteria is on the shoulders of those who advocate it. I am not convinced that there's any fission power plant that satisfies those criteria. If there is, then maybe it makes sense as a stopgap. If not, we're in a tighter squeeze, and it's even more important that we spend money on the development of alternative energy sources. Now, another thing you could do is plant trees. A tree is an engine for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It does it. It's not the only thing a tree does, but that's one of the things that trees are good for, and it's especially relevant to this issue. Plant forests. That seems to be good advice to mitigate greenhouse warming. Instead, the human species is destroying forests, and we're doing it at a rate of 1 acre of forest every second. Think of that. There goes an acre, there goes an acre, there goes an acre, there goes an acre. We're doing something immensely stupid. And then finally, and maybe the most important of all of the ways of mitigating greenhouse warming, is to deal with the world population crisis. Every human being has a right and a wish to a certain minimum way of life, and that involves cooking food. Carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. And all the other things that you do in your job, many of which involve more greenhouse warming. If we continue exponential population growth, it will overwhelm any of the other measures that I've been talking about, no matter how seriously they are approached. Now, what does it take to make some dent in population growth? Some people have the idea that all you have to do is just make birth control, apparatus, device, pharmaceuticals available, and that's the issue. But that's not the issue. It's not that people, poor people, the billion poorest people on the planet, are too dumb to understand that they shouldn't have more children. That's not the issue. The issue is they are so poor that more children is a kind of social security to provide for their old age. More children is a way to have cheap labor to help with whatever dismal task on the little plot of land they work or whatever it is they're doing that otherwise they couldn't afford. Having children is not the, having lots of children is not the cause of poverty, it is the consequence of poverty, although the causality arrow goes both ways. And the clear indication of how this works is what has been documented all over the planet called the demographic transition. It works in Christian countries and Buddhist countries, capitalist countries, communist countries, of which there are hardly any left, but when there were, it worked there, East and West, and it's absolutely striking. When the per capita income is very low, people have lots of children. When the per capita income rises to a pathetically low level by American affluent standards, but still higher than a lot of people have, the population growth rate automatically decreases. People then see that they can provide in a minimal way for their future. They have some discretionary capital which they then want to spend on something, and their cost-benefit analysis then works out so that they have fewer children. And maybe we can think back to our great-grandparents and remember what size families were common then, and think of how much larger it was than today. Is that because they were too stupid? It's not. They made another kind of choice. Now, let me quickly run through, again, this list and just remind you of why each of these steps makes sense by themselves, even apart from greenhouse warming. Cut out the CFCs, we've already talked about that. That protects the very fragile ozone layer. Greater fuel efficiency. If for a given amount of fuel you get more power out, that's obviously good economics. And, you know, we hear about the danger of being dependent upon foreign sources of oil. And this is used as an argument by this administration, for example, to permit ecologically dangerous offshore oil drilling, because we have to have domestic sources. We don't want to be dependent on foreigners. But if we make much more efficient use of the oil we already have, then that's the same as discovering new sources of oil, right? And on finding alternative energy sources, clearly that works in the same direction. If we had vast solar arrays that were absorbing sunlight and converting them into electricity, then that would be an alternative to importing tankers worth of oil from some foreign country. And in addition, it's a good technology to have against the day when the oil runs out. The sun doesn't run out, or at least not for 5 billion years, and I figure that's good enough. Planting forests or at the least stopping destroying forests makes enormous sense in terms of species diversity. All of those organisms, mainly plants, that we're knocking off without knowing anything about them, including their possible pharmacological and other benefit for human beings. And also, we grew up in forests. We primates. We have a natural affinity to forests. We feel better, or at least I'll speak for myself. I like being in forests. And then finally, on the population growth rate, it's very clear, I don't have to go through it for this audience, how important that is to the future stability, political and economic, and foodstuffs and everything else of the planet, even apart from the ecological issues. So what I say to those who complain it's too uncertain, beyond pointing out that the standards that were applied to the Cold War are to be applied here, I say, look, every one of these steps makes good sense, makes good economic sense. And think of all the industries that are implied by what I just said, especially alternative energy sources. There is money to be made in developing a technology which will appropriately address greenhouse warming. Well, I want to stop in a moment. Just want to make one or two summary remarks. If you burn a lump of coal somewhere, the carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere, and you know, carbon dioxide molecules are exceptionally stupid. They don't know anything about national boundaries. They don't have passports. They are wholly innocent of the important concept of national sovereignty. They just casually cross over national boundaries, one after the other. There is a lesson. The world is a unity. The national boundaries have no bearing on these global environmental issues. No one nation can solve this problem by itself. It has to be all the nations working together. What is more, there is no way to mitigate these problems so that we will introduce the mitigating technology, or whatever it is today, and in 2 or 3 or 4 years, or something comparable to a political term of office, the problem will be solved. Instead, you introduce the mitigating circumstances now, and decades hence, when somebody you don't even know will be holding your political office, the benefits will come. Solving these problems requires a transnational and a transgenerational perspective. To my mind, that's a very grown-up kind of perspective. De-provincializing, de-chauvinizing, an awareness of one species on one exquisite, fragile planet. And that's why I think that these very serious global environmental issues may have a deep silver lining. The binding up of the planet, the end of our adolescence, the approach to the maturity of our species. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege to introduce to you Emeritus Professor of Physics, Emeritus Dean of Engineering, Emeritus Provost of Cornell University, and Emeritus President of Cornell University, Dale Corson, who will introduce Carl.
Professor Terzian, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Carl Sagan for his lecture, The Age of Exploration. Dr. Sagan first crossed my consciousness one day in 1967 when Professor Thomas Gold, chairman of our astronomy department at the time, came to my office. I was university provost at the time, to tell me about Carl Sagan, promising young astronomer at Harvard, whom Tom said he thought we could get. He told me that Sagan was a brilliant planetary scientist, and furthermore, he had a great ability to tell the lay public in understandable terms what astronomy and science are all about. This latter particularly caught my attention. It represented a unique ability, and we needed more of it in the university. I responded that this seemed like a good opportunity, and why didn't he make an offer? Professor Gold said he had no money, and that I would have to provide the funds. Now, this is a game that every entrepreneurial department chairman tries to play. But I didn't dismiss Gold as quickly as I might have some people. I'd known Tom for a long time. I'd been chairman of the search committee that brought him to Cornell, also from Harvard. Harvard's good recruiting ground. Tom's always been an exciting person to have around, with more ideas per second than anyone else, and I've always enjoyed talking with him. He has ideas about everything. The expanding universe, how to ride a unicycle, pulsars, Carl Sagan. But there's a problem. Sometimes his ideas are wrong. On the theory of riding the unicycle, for example, I think he never learned. But usually he's right. He was right about pulsars from the first moment. He told me that if I put up the money to hire Carl Sagan, I would never regret it. I did put up the money, the offer was made, and Carl came to Cornell, and I have never regretted it. Tom was right. You already know all the great things Carl has done the past quarter century, although you may not appreciate all the solid science he has done. You can take my word for that. I've always been grateful to Carl for his willingness to talk to alumni groups and to other lay groups. When I was president, I asked him to do this billions of times when I could find him. And he always said yes. He did hesitate once when it was a black tie affair in Chicago, but when I explained the importance of the occasion, he accepted. I think he rather liked the black tie part of it, and I'm not sure he ever returned the rented tuxedo. Maybe that's why he's never been able to go back to Chicago. Carl has received more honors and awards than I could possibly relate. Let me limit this reference to reading the citation for one of his recent honors, the Public Welfare Medal of the National Academy of Sciences, the Academy's most prestigious award. For his ability to communicate the wonder and importance of science, to capture the imagination of so many, and to explain difficult concepts of science in understandable terms. That says it all. Carl Sagan on the Age of Exploration.
Thank you, Dale. I never knew that Tommy hit you up for my salary. Grateful to you both. It's true that Tommy Gold recruited me for Cornell. I remember the inducements, a very small and exceptionally good astronomy department, superb ancillary departments in physics, chemistry, and biology, a beautiful campus, laboratory facilities, which were, by some standards, very generous. But still, I hesitated. And I remember Tommy made the final inducement, I think knowing full well what he was doing. He took me on a little trip to Upper Enfield. And I thought, my goodness, here is a national park as exquisite, well, it's not really a national park, here is something as exquisite as any national park I've ever been in, and it would be right on my doorstep, and that is the missing ingredient. And Tommy was extremely persuasive on every level of inducement, and I thank him very much for the invitation. I've lived now in Ithaca longer than I have lived in any other place in my life, and I'm extremely grateful to Cornell and the town of Ithaca. I consider this my true roots. I didn't know what it was I was going to talk to you about tonight, so I tried to pick a topic which was sufficiently broad and ambiguous that whatever I thought I would talk about would fit. However, what I've decided to talk about doesn't fit. Well, maybe it does. We humans have had civilization only for about 10,000 years. Our species is a few 100,000 years old. Our genus, the genus Homo, is a few million years old. And therefore, for the vast bulk of our tenure on Earth, we were something other than sedentary. And the word has such an aura of self-congratulation, civilized. What were we? We were hunters and foragers. We wandered in small, itinerant, extended families, and our knowledge of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is due to a few courageous and far-seeing anthropologists who went and lived with the few remaining hunter-gatherer groups before they were finally and utterly destroyed by civilization. The anthropologist from whom I learned the most about hunter-gatherers is actually here with us, Richard Lee of the University of Toronto. He studied a people, the Kung San of the Kalahari Desert in the Republic of Botswana. And I want to just give a little flavor about my understanding of our ancestors from Richard Lee's study of the Kung San. I want you to know I practiced before the mirror for about half an hour. The first thing that I think is very important is that they are highly technological. The technology is wood and stone and domestication of fire technology. but it's absolutely technology. There are experts and other people who are not quite as good at the technology. But not only are they technological for fun, they are technological because their lives depend upon it. Chipping and flaking stone tools back before they had a little trickle of metal into their economy is very difficult to do, and of course they did it superbly well. And the archaeological and anthropological record is clear that we were technologists all the way back to the beginning. So the idea that science and technology is something new, something unusual, something we can even find books that say not really very human, is completely backwards. Technology is, if anything, the most characteristically human activity, although, as I'll mention later, it is not exclusively a human activity. Now, one very interesting insight, I thought, is hunter-gatherer tracking techniques. A small group with their bows and poisoned arrows and digging tools and a few other lightweight technological contrivances is following the game. They come near a stand of trees. They take one close look at the ground. Immediately, they know how many animals went by, what their ages and sexes were, how long ago they passed. This one is lame in the back left foot. At the pace they're going, we should be able to overtake them in another 2 hours if we hurry. Now, how do they know all that? In fact, what do they notice in order to follow the game on which their lives pretty well depend? One thing is a hoof print. Different animals have different characteristic shapes of their hooves. Different size animals leave different size hoof prints. But the decay of the hoof crater, the falling of pebbles in, the collapse of the raised rims, debris blown into it, tells you age. And in fact, it reminds me of nothing so much as determining ages of planetary surfaces by looking at how fresh the impact craters are. I think the reason that studying cratering physics seems so natural to us is because we've been doing it for 1 million years. They also know that herd animals in the hot sun like to avoid the sun. If there is a shadow on the ground, they will deviate from their path to just run through the shadow a little bit. Well, where the shadow is depends on where the sun is. And therefore, when you see the deviation, you know that there had to be a shadow at that spot when they passed. Well, where in the sky did the sun have to be in order to cast that shadow? Oh, it was 11 o'clock this morning. Now, I don't claim that every contemporary, well, there are none, but back 10, 20 years ago, every contemporary Kung San made a scientific calculation, did the trigonometry of the angle of the sun. That's not what it's about. This was tradition. Each generation taught the next, but someone had to have figured it out. And that someone had to be a scientist. And this is another reminder that we've been scientists and technologists from the beginning. Now, having said that, I want to turn to the important and rueful fact that every human culture has considered itself at the center of the universe. What's this about? Well, I think it's very straightforward. Back then, in hunter and forager times, Many modes of modern nocturnal entertainment were unavailable. Some were available, but many were not. Television was not available. So over the dying embers of the campfire, people watched the stars. And they did it, I imagine, for many reasons. One, it is just dazzling. And we today, living in under polluted skies and in cities with light pollution, have mainly forgotten how gorgeous the night sky can be. It is not only an aesthetic experience, but it elicits unbidden feelings of reverence and awe. Secondly, people made up stories about the stars. They invented Rorschach tests up there, follow the dots, constellations. Look like a bear to you, Og. Yes, I guess it does. And then forced their children to memorize these absolutely arbitrary patterns. I don't see the bear's tail, Dad, shut up. And then myths were invented either before or after. So these were visual reminders of stories. The bear ate your grandpa, something like that, was put up in heaven as an example. Or there was the story first, and then people put the bears up there. But beyond that, there was something enormously practical. That is, the stars and their rising and setting are a great clock and calendar in the sky. And in the absence of artificial timepieces, that's extremely important, because there are certain seasons of the year when the herds are running. There are certain seasons of the year when the trees are ripe with nuts or fruit. And if you know what those seasons are, and you know what the moment is, you can prepare, and you can also eat. Now, the most superficial examination of the sky shows the stars are rising in the east. Some of them pass directly overhead, and some of them pass on small circles close to the horizon. But they all rise in the east, they all set in the west. And then, in the daytime, they do something else. They somehow go around the bottom of the earth that none of us has ever seen. It's flat as a board, of course. And then the next morning, they come up again in the east. Now, there's absolutely no doubt from this fact that the stars, the planets, the sun, and the moon all go around us, and we're obviously not moving, that we are at the center of the universe. It's an observed fact. Anybody who denies that there's something wrong with them. This is the geocentric conceit. Now, not only did every culture draw this conclusion, but I think it's clear that our ancestors took enormous personal satisfaction in it. Because think about it, we are at the center of the universe. The center of the universe is surely an important place. Not only that, what other animals, what plants make use of the apparent motion of the stars? Only us. Therefore, the stars have been put there for our benefit. And the sun and the moon are practical objects. Maybe there was some confusion. Maybe you know the old story about the Persian wise man and philosopher who was asked which is more useful, the sun or the moon, and replied, of course, the moon, because the sun shines in the daytime when it's light out anyway. Whereas the moon only shines at night when we need a little light. But even when people got things, a little wrong, the centrality of our position was stunning. And I imagine an extraterrestrial visitation of the sort that there is absolutely no evidence for, coming upon the Earth, of course, running around the sun once every year, and then listening in on what people all over the planet are saying. And they're saying, we're at the center, we're important, we're special, everything goes around us. And then I imagine the extraterrestrials thinking of us as, I don't know, the planet of the idiots. But that's too harsh, because there's a resonance here between the most obvious interpretation of absolutely straightforward observational facts that every person can verify for him or herself, a resonance between that and our emotional hopes and needs. The idea that the universe is made for us, not because of any particular merit of ours, but just because we're here, or just because we're human. To me, this seems to resonate with the same psychic wellsprings responsible for the view that our nation is special and the center of the universe, which, by the way, is the literal meaning of the Middle Kingdom for centuries applied by the Chinese to China. And even those who haven't made it that explicit, nationalists of all stripes. You can see it, by the way, in the maps, how often each nation has itself at the center of the map. And other nations look at it as extremely peculiar to see Peru at the center of the map. What's it doing there? It's weird. And the same psychic wellsprings that say that our gender, or our ethnic group, or our particular melanin content in the skin, or a particular language, or headdress, or clothing styles, or convention of pulling out the handkerchief when we sneeze, or anything, is important and central, and all those alternative ways of being human are somehow less central, less important, less worthy than we are. We have a weakness, and scientists are creatures of the culture in which they swim, in which they have grown up, and so we also are vulnerable to this siren song, which we can call chauvinism, or geocentrism, or anthropocentrism. So, you know the story about what happened next, except for a little blip associated with the name of Aristarchus of Samos. We went on, every human culture, every great philosopher, every scientist, every religious leader, thinking we were at the center of the universe. We put it in various guises in our scriptures, declared the scriptures to be infallible, thereby making it not just a secular, but a religious crime to even think about the issue, until in the late 15th century, an astronomer, cleric from Poland named Nicholas Copernicus thought he had an alternative idea, namely that the sun was at the center and the Earth, like the other planets, went around it. He knew that this was dangerous stuff, and so he withheld the publication of his book until he was on his deathbed. And even then, the way it worked out, when the book was published, it had a preface by a well-meaning friend of his, Alexander Osiander, which essentially said, "Dear reader, when you look at this book, it may appear that the author is saying that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. He doesn't really believe that. You see, this book is for mathematicians. If you're not a mathematician, close the book." I'm paraphrasing slightly. Mathematicians find that if you wish to know where Jupiter will be 2 years from next Wednesday, you can get a good answer by assuming that the sun is at the center. This is a mere mathematical fiction, and it does not challenge our holy faith, and please have no emotional angst in reading this book. And this peculiar split brain compromise actually lasted for almost 2 centuries, in which people actually said, well, it's all right, it's only from mathematicians. The Bible says the earth is at the center, we all believe that. And then, as you know, Galileo made a forthright and brilliant defense of Copernicus, based in part on a set of observations from the newly invented astronomical telescope. And the church got increasingly annoyed. Galileo remained obdurate. I once had the pleasure, at the behest of Franco Pacini, director of the Arcetri Observatory, who is also with us here today, to actually trod in Galileo's footsteps and hold a close replica of his telescope. In any case, when Galileo became too insistent, the princes of the church showed him the instruments of torture in the dungeons. They weren't making any particular point, just thought he'd like to see them. And shortly thereafter, Galileo made his famous confession in which he abjured the abominable doctrine that the sun and not the earth was at the center. But the stage had been set, the debate went on, and when in the 18th century Bradley discovered the aberration of light, and then in the 19th century the long-sought annual parallax was found, the opposition collapsed. And now everybody is taught that the earth is not at the center of the universe. Except, I think there's a lot of evidence that we are all geocentrists with a heliocentric veneer that's been painted on us. Think, for example, about our language. Sunrise. I was up before sunrise. Sunset. It was a gorgeous sunset. But the sun isn't rising or setting. The earth is turning. Think of how difficult it is for us to simply parse a simple word or phrase which conforms to the Copernican perspective. Billy, be sure to be home before the rotation of the earth makes the local horizon occult the sun. Billy's gone before you're halfway through. Why isn't there any snappy phrase like sunrise or sunset in the Copernican context? Recent opinion polls show that 25% of adult Americans do not know that the earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it. In China, the figure is 70%. If you bear in mind that the Copernican perspective gets a lot of press in the United States. I mean, there is NASA. There are television programs other than In Search of or Obscure and Erroneous Mysteries or whatever it's called. We do hear that the sun is at the center, and still a quarter of us have missed it. And in China, you can see where there isn't a NASA and where the television programs are much less sophisticated, a much larger percentage of people have missed it. If anything like China is typical, it may be that today, 5 centuries after Copernicus, most people on this planet still think, in their heart of hearts, that the Earth is at the center. So I think congratulations on our insights in deducing are important. There's something fantastic and great about human beings. There is then actual observation of the circumstances nobody ever thought to look before. And then the result is the daunting and disquieting discovery, no, we're not at the center, no, we're not important. And to my mind, many of the key findings of science, and much of the modern scientific perspective, evolves from debates with that character. So let me just try to outline a few examples. Shortly after Copernicus, there were people who said, okay, maybe we're not at the center of the universe, maybe the sun is. But we're close to the sun. Look, we're almost at the sun. So we're almost at the center of the universe, it's almost as good. Well, was the sun at the center of the universe, which we can loosely translate as at the center of the Milky Way galaxy? Well, the answer is no. We are not at the center, where it looks important, or at least well lit. Instead, we are in, or at least near, an obscure spiral arm 30,000 light years from the center of the Milky Way galaxy, in the galactic boondocks. If you were an intergalactic traveler coming into the Milky Way, what would you think if someone had said, "Excuse me, Captain, that's the center of the Milky Way, it's true, but count out spiral arms with me. See, there's one, there's another one really big and beautiful, there's another one. Then over there you see that somewhat obscure spiral arm? Well, don't look exactly in it, but just a little out of it. See over there? I know it's hard to see. Take a closer look, right there. No, not that one. That one, see? Yeah. The guys who live on that one say they're at the center of the universe, and the entire universe is made for their benefit. What would you think of those guys? And then suppose you had the information, there's not one soul on that planet who thinks otherwise. Every one of them thinks they're at the center of the universe. Then there was a moment when it was thought, well, at least the Milky Way we're in the only galaxy. But no, that's not the case. Not only are there other galaxies, there may be as many as 100 billion of them. Then there was a moment when the Hubble flow was discovered, when it was found that the galaxies are all running away from us, the more distant galaxies running away the faster, as if we had committed some dreadful cosmic social blunder. When there were people who breathed a sigh of relief, this was in the 20s of this century. Look, we're at the center. Our galaxy, at least, we're not at the center of our galaxy, okay, but our galaxy is at the center of the entire universe. And this is based upon a serious misapprehension. There is no center to the universe, at least in ordinary three-dimensional space. And astronomers on any one of these galaxies would see all the others running away from them in the same way that we do. Then there was, for a long time, all through my growing up in undergraduate and graduate school career, the statement, there are no other planets. There that is in no other solar system. There was always a nearby star that was suspected to have planets, and it never did. Barnard's star was for a long time a leading hope. And if there are no other planets, if life has to arise on planets, then there's no other life, and there's no other intelligence, and so in that sense, we're at the center of the universe. Well, one of the things about the age we live in, last 15 years, is that this chauvinism is in the process of teetering and collapsing. Because we find that more than half of the nearby young sun-like stars have circumstellar disks of gas and dust extremely like what has been deduced for the birthing ground of the planets in our solar system, the key datum being that the orbital planes of the planets are very largely coplanar. And this was, by the way, something that Isaac Newton, no less, thought he could deduce the hand of God from. That is, God took each planet and threw it in the initial condition, all in the same plane. But Kant and Laplace independently knew better, and they used nothing more than Newtonian physics. Newton had just missed it. That the conservation of angular momentum meant that an irregular spinning, contracting cloud would collapse into a disk, and the planetary formation would occur in the disk, and therefore you had to have, collisions aside, coplanarity of the orbits of the planets. Not only are there amazingly numerous such circumstellar disks, but we now have the first bona fide extrasolar planetary system going around a star that must be at the bottom of the list of potential candidates that anyone would have imagined, a pulsar named B 1257 plus 12. This particular pulsar is something like the size of the Cornell campus. It's something like an atomic nucleus the size of the Cornell campus, spinning at 10,000 RPM, 10,000 revolutions per minute. It's a supernova remnant. There was a colossal catastrophe that blew off most of the mass of that star. And going around it are at least 3 planets, 2 roughly Earth-like mass, 1 roughly lunar mass, a little in closer than Mercury, Venus, and the Earth. And whether these planets survived the supernova explosion or formed recently out of the supernova debris, whichever it is, the processes which lead to planets look to be a very broad and general application. And the technology is now improving so that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, in other words, in the lifetime of most of the students in this audience, we ought to have completed comprehensive surveys of the nearest few hundred stars, maybe much more than that, to see what planetary systems they have. So this chauvinism, I think we can also chalk off. Now, there's been the view that if there's nothing special about us in space, maybe there's something special about us in time. We've been put here by the Creator to take care of things. Stewardship is the very engaging word that is often used. Who knows what would happen to the environment without us? So we have an obligation to make sure everything goes as God would have wished it. The only trouble with this idea, well, there are several, but for me the principal trouble with this idea is that 99.998% of the lifetime of the universe from its beginning to now was over before any human appeared on the scene. So if we are the caretakers, where have we been for most of the time we're supposed to be doing our job? We have been terribly lax. I could see that the chief gardener might be very annoyed with us, which in turn might explain a great deal. We could not have been put here as caretakers because we have not been taking care. A, because we weren't here, and B, because when we have been here, we haven't been doing very well either. Then there was the view that if there's nothing special about our position in space or our position in time, there's something special about our motion. We have a privileged frame of reference. This was the classical absolute motion physics that every great physicist bought into until 1905. Albert Einstein, a keen critic of privilege in the social sphere, immediately mistrusted the contention that the planet we happen to live on was affixed to an imaginary frame of reference which had special merit with regard to the laws of nature, and instead asked what kind of physics would it be if you deduced the same laws of physics no matter what planet you lived on and what star you lived on. And that is one approach to special relativity, which is repeatedly confirmed and is the way the universe is put together. Another chauvinism biting the dust. Now, this is a set of what Annie Drian has called the great demotions. And there are people who find it very upsetting, who still long to be at the center. And one area where you can see the emotions not hidden but written out in clear is in special creation. The notion that we are the particular objects of the devotion of the creator of the universe, that we're different from the other animals, never mind plants, not just in degree but in kind. And you know the list. No one else has altruism, compassion. No other animal loves their young. Nobody else can foresee the future consequences of present action. Nobody else has art or music. Nobody else can use tools. Nobody else can make tools. And this list, it goes on, is essentially agreed to by Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Hobbes, Locke, all the great figures in philosophy with the single exception of David Hume, hats off to him, bought into by all scientists, including highly skeptical ones up until the year 1859, bought into, of course, by all the religious leaders of at least the Western religions, especially the Judeo-Christian Islamic religion. And in 1859, Charles Darwin made the first and heroic effort at pricking this balloon, showing that one species could in fact evolve by absolutely natural processes without anything foreordained from another species. And then when he got up the courage, it took a great deal of it, more than a decade later, he published his second book on the subject, suggesting not only does it apply to lots of species, but us too. We and the chimps have a common ancestor. They're our cousins. This contention really makes a lot of people upset. Have you been to a zoo lately? Have you looked at what a chimpanzee does? Maybe you're related to chimps, buddy, but I'm not. Well, we can learn about chimp behavior in zoos about as well as we can learn about human behavior in jails. And for exactly the same reason. They don't bring out the best in us. But when people like Jane Goodall devote themselves to observing chimpanzees in their natural habitats, the chimps get used to them. The chimps have no trouble recognizing after a while that the humans are somewhat inept chimps. Then we find very different behavior. And I can't resist telling the story of Geza Taleki, a anthropologist and animal behaviorist who wished to learn chimpanzee technology, particularly the termite fishing industry in which they are adept. And so he apprenticed himself for 9 months to a chimp named Leakey, who was expert. Now, the chimpanzee termite fishing industry goes as follows. You find a reed, not any kind of reed, the right kind of reed. You strip it of supernumerary branches, feel that it's right, and then go to the enormous termite mound. Now, each night, the termites cover over the entrances to their nests. The chimp takes one look, scratches away 2-3 places where the entryways have been walled up, takes the reed or grass stem, in one deft motion, puts it down into the termite mound, gives a few twists, carefully pulls it out. The thing is covered with termites. The chimp goes, nom, 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 and here is a good source of protein. Now, if a human were dropped down in this same place and had a need of protein, this source is unavailable to humans. Taleki, spending full time on this problem for months, could A, not break off the right kind of reed, in fact had to use the leftovers that chimps had picked out, could not after 9 months find the openings to the apertures that the chimp takes one look at and opens up. Could not put it down deftly, would do that and the thing would come out accordioned. Could not wiggle it enticingly to get the termites on, and could not withdraw it without scraping off almost all the termites. At the end of 9 months, he'd come up with 1 termite per. Chimps know how to do stuff. And how do young chimps know to do what Geza Taleki did not learn how to do? They were apprenticed for years. By the way, in Taleki's wonderful paper, in the acknowledgments, he thanks his patient tutor and apologizes for his failures because they are not the fault of the being he was apprenticed to. It's just humans aren't very good at this stuff. There is, in fact, a bonobo, a kind of chimp, who lives in Atlanta, who not only knows how to use stone tools, but knows how to make stone tools. This source of human pride is, again, misplaced. Now, of course, there are differences between chimps and us, and we have electric light bulbs, police cars, CD players, nuclear weapons, all sorts of things that chimps don't have, but we can't say that they don't have any technology. And when it became possible in the late 19th century to do DNA-based sequencing, you could get a quantitative measure of the relationship between humans and chimps. And it turns out that the two species share 99.6% of their active genes. So one way to look at that is 0.4% is a much larger number than we had guessed. And another way to look at that is, you want to know about us, take a look at chimps. There's a lot there to learn. In any case, the idea of special creation is really an idea for another time. If nothing else but the molecular biological evidence were available, it would be very clear that there is nothing in us that is qualitatively different from our nearest chimpanzee relatives. That then takes us to the present stands, where these great chauvinism battles are taking place. One is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We have not found life, much less intelligence, anywhere else yet. We send spacecraft to other planets to look for life. We construct large radio telescopes and listen if anyone is sending us a message lately. Both of these activities have led to occasional tantalizing data, but none of it of a sufficient quality to say that we've detected life or intelligence elsewhere. In our ignorance, the geocentrists find hope. They confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. You haven't found life elsewhere? There isn't any. We're the only living creatures on the planet, in the universe, on this planet. You haven't found intelligence elsewhere? There isn't any elsewhere. It's only here. We are at the center of the intellectual cosmos. And while I could give you what I consider to be a strong plausibility argument why this conceit is also erroneous, it's only fair to say that nobody knows the answer to this issue. We have not found life or intelligence elsewhere. We are in the course of looking. Maybe we will find it tomorrow. Maybe it will take centuries. Maybe we will never find it. And all we have to do is keep an open mind. There's no other approach. You don't have to make up your mind in the absence of evidence. And then finally, there is a new and, to my mind, bizarre field for this debate, something called the anthropic principle, which would be much better called the anthropocentric principle, which comes in strong, weak, and various shades of middling flavors. The weak anthropic principle says, if the laws of nature and the fundamental constants of nature were significantly different, then the paths which led to us would have been different and we wouldn't be here. That is unexceptionable, certainly true. No problem. But then there is a strong anthropic principle, which to my mind is dangerously close to the following argument. We would not be here if the laws of nature and the values of the physical constants were other than they are. Therefore, the laws of nature and the physical constants are as they are in order for the universe to produce us. God had us in mind at the time the universe was made, and here we are back at the center of the universe again. There are many things which can be said about this, including the the point that Philip Morrison, among others, has made, that who has traced through what other laws of nature and physical constants will lead to the functional equivalence of life and intelligence? It's impossible to do. You can also argue against it that it is not very vulnerable to experimental investigation. But I would just like to point out that there's something telling about calling it the anthropic principle, because the same laws of nature and the same physical constants are required to make a rock as to make a person. Why is it not called the lithic principle? So there's a strong and weak lithic principle. And in the strong lithic principle, the laws of nature and the physical constants are as they are, so rocks could come into being. Not nearly as satisfying, right? But if rocks could philosophize, I bet you we would hear nothing of the anthropic principle, and at the cutting edge of rock philosophy would be the lithic principle. I have only 2 slides. If I can show the first one, please. This is a absolutely typical astronomical photograph of what's called a star field. Now, focus is important, please. Oh, went right through it. That's pretty good. Back a little. Yep, good. Now, take a look up here. What you are looking at is some, I'm not sure, 10,000 stars, something like that. One in front of another, so that they seem so closely packed that from a greater distance or with a smaller aperture telescope, you could not even tell they are individual stars. This is what the Milky Way is. It's stars in line of sight so closely packed that it looks like a continuum of light. Many of these stars are more or less like the sun. As I was saying before, it now looks as if planets are a frequent, if not invariable, accompaniment of star formation. And again, I ask you to consider the contention that the only life and intelligence in the universe is, let's say, that dot. No, not that one. That one right there. See? That's it. Nowhere else. Maybe hard to extrapolate from one example, and one example is all we have, but this is so resonant with the other human conceits I tried to outline in the Great Demotions that I am suspicious of it for that reason alone. Lights, please. I want to conclude with one of the many psychic rewards that planetary exploration has brought to me. As Ed Stone outlined in his talk this morning, there was a moment when the 2 Voyager spacecraft had completed their close-up reconnaissances of the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune systems. No other planets that we were going to rendezvous with further out in the solar system. It was now possible to turn the cameras close to the sun, and if the worst happened and we burnt out the optics, so what? There was nothing else we were going to photograph. Because I had wanted, from the time of the Saturn encounter, to take a picture of the Earth from that remote vantage point. And at the same time, I want us to get to Uranus and Neptune and see what was there, and the spacecraft phenomenally outperformed its design specifications, and the bulk of our knowledge of the outer solar system has come because JPL did such a brilliant job with these extraordinary spacecraft coming in on time, under cost, and vastly exceeding the fondest hopes of their designers. Anyway, as Ed well knows, it was by no means easy, even though the downside was almost nil, to turn the cameras back, and it required an actual intervention by the NASA administrators to get it done, but it wasn't. Now, it was clear that because the picture, Voyager 1 picture, was taken from beyond the orbit of Neptune, that the Earth would appear only as a single picture element, a single pixel. We would not even see continents. We could not tell any detail. I still thought it would be useful to do in the same sense that the great frame-filling Apollo 17 picture of the whole Earth has become a kind of icon of our age, because it said something very powerful to us, including the fact that from that perspective, national boundaries were not in evidence. Well, these pictures were taken in part due to the excellent estimates of exposure times by Carolyn Porco. And I'd like to show you in the last slide. Due to motion, the Earth momentarily, no chauvinistic implications, this is just foreground optics, the Earth in a sunbeam. Wait a little bit and it's not in the sunbeam. So there it is. I mean, take a look. It's a pale blue dot. That's us. That's home. That's where we are. On it, everybody you love, everybody you know, everybody you've ever heard of, lived out their days there. The aggregate of all our joy and suffering, thousands of confident ideologies, religions, economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every hopeful child, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer, every revered teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every uncorrupt politician too, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there. The Earth is a very small stage in a great cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, presidents and prime ministers, party leaders, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of the corner of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one part of the dot on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of another part of the dot. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe seem to me challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark, in our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that there's anyone who will come and save us from ourselves. That will happen only if we do. It's been said that astronomy is a humbling experience, and I would add, character building. To me, this is one of many demonstrations through astronomy of the folly of human conceits. To me, this picture underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
Thank you, Carl, for a great speech. I'm already looking forward to your 70th birthday. Professor Sagan will answer questions for a while. If there are microphones in the aisles, if you could come to the microphone, it will make it much easier. He'll field the questions himself.
Thank you, Dale. I'd be glad to answer questions on anything anything I've been talking about, or anything else that's on your mind. I don't promise to be able to answer everything, but I'd be glad to give it a shot. Professor James Henderson is not asking a question, but merely taking a picture. Yes, please.
Yes, please. We'd like to know two things. First one is, who said billions and billions?
That I can answer very quickly. It's someone named Johnny Carson. I never said it. I never, ever said it.
He's off the hook, everybody.
I mean, it's sort of like Humphrey Bogart never said, "Play it again, Sam." Nobody believes it, but
it's elementary, my dear Watson.
Say again?
It's elementary.
It's elementary, my dear Watson, is another, in the movies, he says it. Basil Rathbone says it. But in the Arthur Conan Doyle books, he never says it. Yes, and your second.
Okay, so we also want to know, what, if any, one thing in particular would you have yourself be remembered by?
You know, I hate the one only kind of question, you know. What's your favorite scientist, or what's the greatest discovery in the history of the world? I don't know. I have to leave the decision about how I'm going to be remembered, which I hope will not have to be faced for some time, to others. But thanks very much for the question. Yes.
I was interested in your great emotions, and I certainly
Speak more into
I certainly, let's say, agree in most ways with what you say. Where among the great demotions would you fit in, or would you fit in at all, the appearance of consciousness among humans?
Yes, that's an important question. I'll repeat it because her voice, while lovely, is very soft. The question is, what about the evolution of consciousness? Isn't this another of the conceits that only humans are conscious? I'm paraphrasing. but would I include that in the demotions? Annie Drian and I wrote a book called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, in which we tried systematically to look at each of these, what I've called conceits. And I think the most startling thing we learned, or I'll speak for myself, that I learned in the course of doing that book, was how we kept getting it wrong on these issues. Now, consciousness has various meanings. If it means an awareness of the external world and modifying your behavior to take account of the external world, then I think microbes are conscious. If you mean deep thoughts, like Bishop Berkeley's contention that nothing exists except what's in his mind, I'm with the microbes myself. You see, how do you know that I think any thoughts? Only because I happen to be communicating to you. You can't easily tell that I have philosophical thoughts by looking at me drinking this cup of water, right? So imagine that I was mute, that I could not communicate by speech or writing or anything else. Then how would you know if I had such thoughts? The evidence for not just the so-called higher apes, but running through the apes and the monkeys, to me is very persuasive that they have thoughts. Not only deep philosophical thoughts, but useful practical thoughts, like lying, like deceit, like planning to fool others, thinking about it far in advance. But let me just give one little image, which I like because it covers many different grounds. These are the results of work at the Arnhem colony in the Netherlands, where there's a large free roaming community of chimps. Males are testosterone-riven and subject to raging hormonal imbalances. They get angry at each other and pick up rocks. They go quite a distance to get the rocks in order to confront the guy who they don't like and throw stones. The very act of going over there out of sight of the enemy to pick up the stones and then bring them back to throw the stones shows think ahead, understanding the goal and aware of yourself and the opposition. But the most interesting thing is it is common for female chimps, seeing the males burdened with their stones, to walk up to them and disarm them, pluck the stones out of their arms, open up their fingers, and throw the stones away. And when the males in a huff gather them up, the females disarm them again. So not only do the males know what they have in mind, the females know what they have in mind. And that, to me, not only is consciousness, but a social arrangement I'd like to see more of in humans.
My question is, given all these emotions, what is your personal religion? Or is there any type of God to you? Like, is there a purpose, given that we're just sitting on this speck in the middle of this sea of stars?
Now, I don't want to duck any questions. And I'm not going to duck this one, even though I have high religious personages who are close friends of mine in this room. But let me ask you, what do you mean when you use the word God?
Well, I guess what my question, it's like, is there a purpose for, I mean, given all these demotions, why don't we just blow ourselves up?
Why
It's
don't
like,
we?
Yeah, what is our purpose? I mean,
Let me turn the question around. If we do blow ourselves up, does that disprove the existence of God?
no, I guess not.
I mean, it'll be a little late to
Yeah.
make the discovery, but still.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, since as we kind of make God almost go away in this as he through these demotions, and I don't mean he, because who knows what God is, but
But still saying it makes it
Right.
sort of icky, doesn't it?
yeah, it's tough.
We like it to be a he,
yeah.
don't we?
Yeah. We've been trained to think of it as a he. It seems that through the ages, humans have created a mythological framework that has always often involved some kind of higher spiritual powers. And as
Every human culture has done that.
as that goes away, as we know more and more that, and it seems harder and harder to prove that anything might exist like that, where does that leave us?
On our own. Which to my mind is much more responsible than hoping that someone will save us from ourselves so we don't have to make our best efforts to do it ourselves. And if we're wrong, and there is someone who steps in and saves us, okay, that's all right. I'm for that, but we, hedged our bets. It's Pascal's bargain run backwards. I'll say another word. The word God covers an enormous range of different ideas, and you recognize that in the way you phrased the question. Running from an outsized, light-skinned male with a long white beard sitting in a throne in the sky and tallying the fall of every sparrow, for which there is no evidence. To my mind, if anybody has some, I sure would like to see it. To the kind of God that Einstein or Spinoza talked about, which is very close to the sum total of the laws of the universe. Now, it would be crazy to deny that there are laws in the universe. And if that's what you want to call God, then of course God exists. And there are all sorts of other nuances. There is, for example, the deist God that many of the founding fathers of this country believed in, although it is a secret whose name may not be spoken in some circles, a roi fainéant, a do-nothing king, the God who creates the universe and then retires, and to whom praying to is sort of pointless. He's not here. He went somewhere else. He had other things to do. Now that's also a God. So when you say, do you believe in God? If I say yes or if I say no, you have learned absolutely nothing.
I guess I'm asking you to define yours if you have one.
But why would we use a word so ambiguous that means so many different things?
It gives you freedom to define it
It gives you freedom to seem to agree with someone else with whom you do not agree. It covers over differences. It makes for social lubrication. But it is not an aid to truth, in my view. And therefore, I think we need much sharper language when we ask these questions. Sorry to take so long in answering this, but this is an important issue.
Hi. Me and some of the other students here at Cornell were wondering about your house. Was it some kind of power plant or what?
Power plant.
What was it before it was your house?
Right. Good. All right. I guess what I said, I try to answer questions even that aren't related to what I talked about. I really let myself in for it. Okay. that is a study that Annie and I work in and we love. It was a long time ago the headquarters of the Cornell Sphinx Head Society, in which God knows what abominable rites were performed. But I can assure you, these days, it is extremely placid. And Annie says she's not so sure. Anyway, it's very benign, whatever its early history, which goes back to, I think, 1892, may have been. It also was once a sculpture studio of a remarkable Cornell professor, designer of nuclear accelerators, and sculptor par excellence named Bob Wilson. Yes?
Yeah, I want to know what your views were on astrology. I know it's a related science to astronomy.
On what?
On astrology, extrasensory
Astrology
perception.
is a hoax.
What's, excuse me?
It's a hoax.
Hoax?
H-O-A-X.
So, what about the documented proof of...
Say again?
What about documented proof of studies where
What about what?
ESP, clairvoyance, you totally disagree?
That's different, right? Right?
Okay, well that's...
Astrology is different from ESP and clairvoyance.
Sorry, I confused the two.
But no, I'm happy to answer it. I just want to be clear.
Extrasensory perception, telekinesis, do they exist, and does everybody, do certain individuals have it, and how did it arrive
If
into
it
society?
exists, it would have arisen by evolution, natural selection, the same way as everything else. But what do we mean by extrasensory perception? There is a African freshwater fish that establishes static electric fields and then detects its prey by perturbations in the electric field. We can't do that at all. It doesn't correspond to any of our senses. Does this fish have ESP?
In a sense, yes, but... Okay.
If it does have ESP, is this mysterious? Is it a challenge to science? Or is it just another way of perceiving the world?
It's a different way of perceiving it.
Yeah. So, therefore, if there is ESP, I think the chances are excellent that it can be well understood by science, but to the best of my knowledge, there isn't any ESP. Yes?
Hi, I'd like, first of all, to say that it must be a true privilege to be able to develop a career in something as stimulating intellectually and spiritually as astronomy. Now, my question to you is, what's your opinion on the use of animals in biomedical research?
On what?
The use of animals
in biomedical research. Right. I have struggled greatly with this issue. In part because I have a graduate student, Peter Wilson, who holds my feet to the fire on this issue. For example, I have a 20-year-old leather jacket that I used to wear to Cornell that I don't wear anymore. I do wear it around the house, if truth be told. I am very conflicted on this issue. That gratuitous pain should not be inflicted on other animals, or for that matter, plants, I think is clear. And that animals should not be made to suffer for fairly trivial goals, the making of lipstick, for example, I think is clear. To argue, though, that animals should not be used in the pursuit of medicines and medical procedures that might save the lives of humans is not so clear to me. And Charles Darwin had just the same distinction. He was way ahead of his time in opposing gratuitous pain, but would also not argue that no animal experiments should be done. And I think if I had to explain, somehow it was my job to do so, some people whose child was dying because a medical procedure was unavailable, which might very well have been available if animal experimentation had been performed. I don't know how I do that justification. Now you might say to me that I'm putting humans higher than other animals. And where do I come off doing that, especially at the end of an evening where I've been decrying chauvinism? This to me is like the argument that is sometimes, Dave Morrison mentioned it in his talk today. Why should we take any steps to save ourselves if an asteroid is going to hit the Earth, since asteroids have hit the Earth in the past? And, others have gone, so we might be here, so we'll go, so, whatever it is, the raccoons will have their chance, or the ants, or the sulfur oxidation state altering submarine worms will inherit the Earth. At this point, I have no difficulty in, since I happen to be, it's an accident of birth, a human being, to justify human beings trying to survive under sometimes trying circumstances. That's my judgment. I'm sure if I were a lizard up here, I would be talking about, yes, let's sacrifice the humans so we can get better medicine for the lizards. After all, I'm a lizard. I'm sorry, I can't help it. I'm a human. I'm not saying this as if I know what your point of view is, but I'm just trying to clarify how I think about it.
I'd first like to say happy birthday, Professor Sagan. I'm sorry I didn't get you a present. Now, there are various structures in the Andes and also formations and crops in northern England, which people say are results of extraterrestrial interference or appearances.
The plains of Nazca.
Yes.
N-A-Z-C-A.
I was just wondering about your views of these, whether or not we actually have been landed upon.
Yeah. Well, one way to look at this is, first of all, where did all this stuff about the plains of Nazca being somehow mysterious and extraterrestrial come from? It came from a guy named Erich von Däniken, a Swiss hotelier, who wrote a book called Chariots of the Gods, which became a worldwide bestseller, in which he argued as follows. On the plains of Nazca in Peru, there are large drawings. Some of them look like spiders, some look like turkeys, some are straight lines. Von Däniken concluded that the straight lines were airfields, and the other stuff was messages that doltish humans were instructed in carving in the desert of Peru by extraterrestrial overseers. Why? What's this about? We don't know how to draw big pictures without extraterrestrials telling us what to do? Some of those straight lines are 6 inches across. How big are the airplanes that land on those airfields? What are we to imagine? An interstellar spacecraft effortlessly crosses hundreds, thousands of light years. The cargo doors open, and out come little propeller-driven airplanes about that size, like my 3.5-year-old son plays with. And they land in Peru and tell people, we got toy airplanes, please make airports for us. And by the way, make a big turkey. This is silly. The common feature in all of von Däniken's fantasizing is that he sells our ancestors short. He goes to Egypt, he sees pyramids. Boy, those are big. How big are the constituent blocks? 100 tons. 100 tons, says von Däniken. I couldn't lift a block that weighed half that. Therefore, human beings are unable to lift blocks of that mass. Therefore, extraterrestrials did it QED. But if he had read Herodotus, never mind archaeology, this Herodotus is written, it's an English translation, it's a German translation. We have an idea about quarries and logs as rollers and rafts up the Nile and how humans could do it. We're perfectly capable of building things big, even those of us who lived a long time ago. even those of us with dark skin, people know how to build big. And the idea of extraterrestrial visitation is required every time a naive observer can't figure out how something could be done is silly. The one possible positive aspect of von Däniken is that it might, in frustration, drive an occasional reader into archaeology.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. I'll be honest with you. A friend of mine, well, now an acquaintance of mine, sold me the idea that Steven Spielberg was going to be here, so that's why I came. But look, I'm really
sorry.
happy. wait, I'm not done. I'm not done.
The first I heard of it, I'm awfully sorry that you're disappointed.
I know, but I'm glad I came, because when you were doing all that thing about pointing out where Earth is and how little we are and compared to the universe, wouldn't it be easier for man, women, music man and genetics? Humans.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay. For humans to think that we're not the center of the universe, if we have all this now data, it would be. I mean, it's easier now. Why can't we believe? Like the challenge now is to think that we are in some way, and somehow, the center of the universe in some kind of way. Not physically, not intellectually, but somehow I don't want to make it like a purpose, but some.
Yes, you do.
Okay, it's a purpose, but you know what? It's now easier for us to believe. Okay, it's easier. We can put our mind at rest. But somehow, aren't we closing our mind?
Aren't we closing our mind?
By not saying that we're not in some way the center of the universe.
But imagine that you're an octopus.
Okay. Okay, wait. I got it. Wait. What about organisms are the center of the universe? Okay, I'll change it. Humans, because we can communicate and understand each other. I'm just saying it because, but what I'm saying, but your organisms.
My mind is open. You come up with evidence we're at the center of the universe, I will gladly confess defeat.
Not now, but.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to say I'm glad I didn't get to ask my first question about God, and I left it to him. But my second question, which might be oversimplified, is if every matter has an antimatter, and the Big Bang Theory created the universe, which is supposedly the matter, where is the antimatter in the Big Bang Theory?
There is quite sophisticated cosmological speculation theory on this. Clearly, if there's an excess of one over the other, and the universe is well mixed, then, since matter and antimatter annihilate each other, whichever had a my good friend, the emeritus everything, the emeritus dismisser suggests that it's time to come to an end. Let me take, Dale, if I may, one or two more questions, and then I'll stop.
Do you think that we're now as demoted as we can get, or
No.
do you think can you see what further humiliations can you see for us in the near future?
Dr. Wing asked, what further demotions, humiliations do I foresee for us? You see, the idea that our sense of self-worth comes not from anything that we've done, not from anything worthy, but by an accident of birth, is where the crux of the humiliation is, in my opinion. I would say those of us worried about being demoted, those of us who wish for us to be important, should do something important. We should make an easily understandable, achievable, and inspiring goal for the human species, and then set out and do it. that would give us the confidence that we sorely lack by being dependent on our self-esteem being based on nothing we do. We want to have self-esteem? Let's make a planet in which nobody is starving. Let's make a planet in which men and women have equal access to power. Let us make a planet in which no ethnic group has it over another ethnic group. Let's have a planet in which science and engineering is used for the benefit of everybody on the planet. And my personal idiosyncrasy, let's have a world in which we go to other worlds. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Carl Sagan is one of the preeminent astronomers of our time. He is known for bringing the heavens to our living rooms with his PBS series Cosmos. His latest work is The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. It explores the country's growing fascination with pseudoscience, astrology, faith heals, the supernatural, and the like, all superstitions that he says threaten to undermine true science. I am pleased to have him here, and I also take note of the fact that he is the David Duncan Professor of Astronomy and Space Sciences and Director of the Laboratory for Planetary Studies at Cornell University, Distinguished Visiting Science at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, California Institute of Technology, and co-founder and president of the Planetary Society, the largest space interest group in the world, and a former Pulitzer Prize winner. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Great to see you. Listen to this. I hate to read too much, but this is it's almost like they've been reading your book. This is from the New York Times for Friday, May 24. Americans flunk science, a study finds. Less than half of all American adults understand that the Earth orbits the sun yearly, according to a basic science survey. Nevertheless, there's enthusiasm for research, except in some fields like genetic engineering and nuclear power that are viewed with suspicion. Only about 25% of American adults get passing grades in a National Science Foundation survey of what people know about basic science and economics. I mean, this is singing your song, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly what I'm talking about in the demon-haunted world. My feeling, Charlie, is that it's not that pseudoscience and superstition and New Age so-called beliefs and fundamentalist zealotry are something new. They've been with us for as long as we've been human. But we live in an age based on science and technology with formidable technological powers.
Science and technology are propelling us forward at accelerating rates.
That's right. And if we don't understand it, by we I mean the general public, if it's something that, oh, I'm not good at that, I don't know anything about it, then who is making all the decisions about science and technology that are going to determine what kind of future our children live in? Just some members of Congress? But there's no more than a handful of members of Congress with any background in science at all. And the Republican Congress has just abolished its own Office of Technology Assessment, the organization that gave them bipartisan, competent advice on science and technology. They say, we don't want to know. Don't tell us about science and technology.
Surprising, because Gingrich is genuinely interested, I think, in these kinds of things as a, out of his own intellectual curiosity. Does the president still have a science advisor?
He does, John Gibbons, and the vice president is scientifically literate. Yes,
scientifically, a science maven. I mean, you blast them all. Creationists, Christian scientists who you say would rather allow their children to suffer than give them insulin or antibiotics. Astrologers come in for particular scorn on your part.
Well, I would say scorn, just derision.
Derision. A more generous version of scorn. But what's the danger of all this? I mean, this is not the thing that...
There's two kinds of dangers. One is what I just talked about, that we've arranged a society based on science and technology in which nobody understands anything about science and technology. And this combustible mixture of ignorance and power, sooner or later, is going to blow up in our faces. I mean, who is running the science and technology in a democracy if the people don't know anything about it? And the second reason that I'm worried about this is that science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking. a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along. It's a thing that Jefferson laid great stress on. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Jefferson was amazing in his devotion to science. We think of Jefferson as this man who was literate and who was a passionate articulator of freedom. But if you go to Monticello, exactly, what you appreciate is he was at heart a scientist, a botanist, an architect, geologist. And if you Meriwether Lewis, as we know from Stephen Ambrose, you know, he wanted him to go out and do experimentations and explore and be skeptical and find answers to passages and explore the West.
Exactly right. And there was also an economic grail there if the Northwest Passage was found. Jefferson said that he was at heart a scientist, that he would have loved to have been a scientist. But there were certain events happening in America that called to him, and so he devoted his life to that kind of politics. Indeed. So that generations later, people could be scientists.
Have we, the point is made, and maybe by you, you know, is it, when's the last time we had a president who made a speech about science? You know, I mean, it made
I say that.
Yeah. It is this notion that science is not of great interest to us, in some sense, that somehow we don't want to learn.
You see, people read the stock market quotations and financial pages. Look how complex that is.
And because they know the direct connection to their own.
There's a motivation, but they're capable of large numbers of people. People are able to look at sports statistics. Look how many people can do that. Understanding science is not more difficult than that. It doesn't involve greater intellectual activities. But the thing about science is, first of all, it's after the way the universe really is and not what makes us feel good. And a lot of the competing doctrines are after what feels good and not what's true.
Okay, but you got to make, I'm not sure you'll go this far with me, but I mean, there's a lot of that is about feeling good, and there's a lot of that that's about hocus pocus, but at the same time, there are millions of people who understand science does not prove religion, because religion is faith-based, and therefore you should not deny the value of it because it is faith-based and not scientific.
But let's look a little more deeply into that. What is faith? It is belief in the absence of evidence. Now, I don't propose to tell anybody what to believe, but for me, believing when there's no compelling evidence is a mistake. The idea is to withhold belief until there is compelling evidence. And if the universe does not comply with our predispositions, okay, then we have the wrenching obligation to accommodate to the way the universe really is.
So you step forward to say, I deny all religion because I can't see it proved scientifically?
No. You see,
the value of religious experience and the value of reaching for higher experiences.
Let me say, religion deals with history, with poetry, with great literature, with ethics, with morals, including the morality of treating compassionately the least fortunate among us. All of these are things that I endorse wholeheartedly. Where religion gets into trouble is in those cases that it pretends to know something about science. The science in the Bible, for example, was acquired by the Jews from the Babylonians during the Babylonian captivity of 600 BC. That was the best science on the planet then. But we've learned something since then. Roman Catholicism, Reformed Judaism, most of the mainstream Protestant denominations have no difficulty with the idea that humans have evolved from other creatures, that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, with the Big Bang. They don't have any trouble with that. The trouble comes with people who are biblical literalists, who believe that the Bible is dictated by the creator of the universe to an unerring stenographer.
And so therefore they...
And has no metaphor or allegory.
And from there they make their political and economic choices, and social choices.
And scientific.
And scientific choices. And scientific. And that's part of your problem with that idea.
Exactly.
It is that because for the wrong reasons we make the wrong choices about science.
That's right. So who is more humble? The scientist who looks at the universe with an open mind and accepts whatever the universe has to teach us, or somebody who says everything in this book must be considered the literal truth, and never mind the fallibility of all the human beings involved in the writing of this book?
I mean, I accept that, but I also, the argument being made by many is that, you know, you don't have to, whether a specific scientific act took place as described by some biblical writer is not at the heart of the religious faith and religious experience.
Some people agree with you, and some people don't. Some people think that every jot and tittle in the Bible is essential. You throw one thing away to allegory or metaphor, then it's up to everybody to make their own decisions.
Then how are we, a lot of this has to do with science in the United States. Are we different than other nations?
Absolutely not. You can see this worldwide. In India, there's a madness about astrology. In Britain, it's ghosts. In Germany, it's rays coming up from the Earth that can only be detected by dowsers. Every country has its own specialties. We seem to be fascinated by UFOs right now. But one thing...
What is that? Before we leave UFOs, tell me about you and Professor Mack.
John Mack is a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, who I've known for many years. We were arrested together at the Nevada nuclear test site protesting U.S. testing in the face of a Soviet moratorium on testing. And many years ago, he asked me, what is there in this UFO business? Is there anything to it? And I said, absolutely nothing, except, of course, for a psychiatrist. He is a psychiatrist. Well, he looked into it and decided that there was so much emotional energy in the reports of people who claimed to be abducted that it couldn't possibly be some psychological aberration, that it had to be true. He believed his patients. I do not believe his patients. Many of these stories are about waking up from a deep sleep and finding your bed surrounded by 3 or 4 short, dour, gray, and sexually obsessed beings who then take you to their spaceship after they slither you through your wall and perform a variety of objectionable sexual experiments.
But here we have Dr. Carl Sagan, astronomer, versus what's his first name? John Mack. MD.
No question. So what's the problem?
He's a scientist.
How can scientists disagree?
He's a scientist.
Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm asking what do you think of this man coming to these conclusions?
I think he is not using the scientific method in approaching his issue.
And when you constantly, I assume you come at him with both barrels in conversation.
And in the demon-haunted world.
And he says?
He says, I don't appreciate the emotional force.
You don't.
Of these reports. But many people awaken from a nightmare with profound emotional force. That doesn't mean that the nightmare is true. It means something went on inside our head.
You were making a point before I jumped to John Mack.
Oh, yeah. What I wanted to say is, going back to the question of adequate evidence on something that's emotionally really pulling you. I lost both my parents about 12 or 15 years ago, and I had a great relationship with them. I really miss them. I would love to believe that their spirits were around somewhere. And I'd give almost anything to spend 5 minutes a year with them.
Do you hear their voices ever?
Sometimes. About 6 or 8 times since their death I've heard it. Carl, just in the voice of my father or my mother. Now, I don't think that means that they're in the next room. I think it means that
They're in your
I've had an auditory hallucination. I was with them so long, I heard their voices so often. Why shouldn't I be able to make a vivid recollection of it?
Here's what's interesting about this for me. I mean, you won't see this, but I'll throw it at you anyway. You convinced me a long time ago that it was arrogant for me or for anyone else to believe that there wasn't some life outside of our...
To exclude the possibility.
To exclude the possibility was an arrogance of intellect that we should not assume. You couldn't prove it, you didn't know it was there, but the arrogance for you...
Right, we don't know if it's there, we don't know if it's not there. Let's look.
And if you take that, why can't you say there's a lot we don't know? There's a lot of power there that we don't know.
There's a lot we don't know.
You know?
That's what I believe.
But
that doesn't mean that every fraudulent claim has to be accepted. We demand the most rigorous standards of evidence, especially on what's important to us. So if some guy comes up to me and a channeler or a medium and says, I can put you in touch with your parents. Well, because I want so terribly to believe that, I know I have to reach in for added reserves of skepticism because I'm likely to be fooled and much more minor to have my money taken.
What was it, Jay-Z Knight?
Yeah, exactly. She has a guy named Ramtha, who's 10,000 years old or
35.
35, yes. And he tells you lots of things, but nothing about what life was like 35,000 years ago.
Shirley MacLaine believes.
Shirley MacLaine believes that Ramtha was her brother.
Things like the Loch Ness Monster, all that.
Again, is it fakes? I mean, the most famous photograph has now been shown to be a fake, but could there be a unknown mammal or even reptile of large dimensions swimming in a Scottish lake? Sure there could. That we don't know about? Sure there could. Who says no?
But nobody.
But the evidence does not support it, does not demonstrate it. So do we say, oh, ridiculous? Yeah. No, we don't do that. We say unproved, which is a Scottish verdict.
Some reviewers differ with your conclusions on this point, that you seem to say it's growing, this kind of pseudoscience.
No, sorry to interrupt. I don't. This is part of being human. Humans have had this way of magical thinking through all of our history. The problem is that today the technology has reached formidable, maybe even awesome proportions. And so the dangers of thinking this way are larger. Not that this is a new kind of thing.
You are living with myelodysplasia.
Or I have been.
You have been. It's in remission. Or you have what?
Well, you know, with diseases of this sort and all cancers.
Cancer of the bone marrow?
It's myelodysplasia is not exactly cancer of the bone marrow, but if untreated, it inevitably leads to leukemia. And the trouble with all these diseases is you never know that you've got every last cell. You can only detect down to a certain level. But down to the level that anybody can detect in terms of how I feel and my stamina and all that, it seems to be gone. Very lucky.
Because you had a sister who enabled you to have a bone marrow transplant.
That's one, and also the enormous advances in in medical science in just the last few years. If I had had this thing 5 or 10 years ago, I would be dead sure as shooting. And then finally, the love and support of my family. All of those have played a central role.
So you're optimistic?
I'm very optimistic, or at least very hopeful.
And just share with us, because of your sense of language and your sense of understanding and being reflective and introspective, what do you think about, and what does it do for you to?
I didn't
to
have any
your doctor
near-death
say to you?
I didn't have any near-death experiences. I didn't have a religious conversion, but
you thought about what it would be like to die.
Certainly, and what it would be like for my family. And I didn't much think about what it would be like for me, because I don't think it's likely there's anything that you think about after you're dead.
That's it.
Yeah, long, dreamless sleep. I'd love to believe the opposite, but I don't know of any evidence. But one thing...
Faith, Carl, faith.
One thing that it has done is to enhance my sense of appreciation for the beauty of life and of the universe and the sheer joy of being alive.
You had a healthy portion of that before this, but even you, it happens to.
Oh, there's no question.
Appreciation.
No question. Every moment, every inanimate object, to say nothing of the exquisite complexity of living beings. You imagine missing it all, and suddenly it's so much more precious.
May you live a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.
Pleasure. Carl Sagan, Science as a Candle in the Dark. The title of the book is The Demon-Haunted World. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.